Thanks everyone for sticking with us today. We hope this conversation is valuable. Jeff, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So we'll get to how your company, Bigfoot Biomedical, came about. But I want to start with the name. How did the name of the company come about?
So we're named Bigfoot because a Wired magazine article talked about my co-founder, who was the first one to hack into existing medical devices and create a closed-loop insulin delivery system that has meaningfully improved the lives of his son and his wife now for the past 5 years. He didn't want to admit he'd done it. Was still actually trying to work to give it to a big company. And the author, in writing about this phenomenon of people hacking into their own medical devices, actually improving them, he thought this was the best example and said, well, a lot of people think this exists. It's been done in the background, but we don't have proof yet, kind of like Bigfoot. And since we are approaching the problem very differently and we're a different kind of company, we took a name that stuck and have made it our identity.
Yeah. So that company started 3 years ago, right? You just
Yes.
had your 3-year birthday in October.
We did.
At the time, you were working as CEO of JDRF, the funding and advocacy group for research in diabetes. What prompted the foundation? What prompted your initiation of the company?
Well, I've been interested in insulin-requiring diabetes, or type 1 diabetes specifically, since my son was diagnosed in 2002. I had previously been a tech entrepreneur, but in very different industries than healthcare. But when my son was diagnosed and I was exposed to type 1 diabetes, I discovered, as everybody who's affected by it does at one point, it's the extreme of a chronic disease where the burden is meaningfully displaced to the patient. It's not the doctor that determines the outcome. Doctor is an important support mechanism, but the patient and what they do and how they live with the disease, the decision they make will actually determine how they do over time and in some cases whether they live or die. I was appalled by the state of technology in 2002 that was applied against this problem. I spent the next, I guess, about 12 years trying to see how I could help to learn about the challenges with the technology itself, but also in the delivery environment of healthcare, the reimbursement challenges. Ended up funding a project at the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation that tried to tackle some of these problems, and then ended up serving as CEO there for 4 years. And while we tackled a number of problems that provided meaningful opportunities, such as FDA, regulatory clarity, actually foundational work in terms of healthcare economics to show continuous glucose monitors and their ability to translate into cost reductions. Actually did a lot of proof of concept work at universities around the world for algorithms to tie together insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitors. And then spent about $35 million directly subsidizing all the players in the spaces of insulin pumps and CGM. But that was the last mile, and it wasn't working. We weren't able to see some of the technologies that were necessary to deliver these kinds of systems, very focused on the patient, connected to the rest of the world. They weren't able to, I think, adapt and embrace some of the developments in technology. And so when my co-founder actually proved it was a DIY project and that literally he could create something better than any company had done before, I said, well, this looks like an opportunity for a startup, and he and I have been on that journey ever since.
So you mentioned your son, who is diabetic.
Yes.
And it's my understanding that just about everybody at Bigfoot has some sort of connection to diabetes, whether they personally have it or someone directly in their family has it. What does that sort of perspective afford you guys as a company that helps you to stand out?
Well, so we're a bit bigger now. We're about 60 people. At the very beginning, it was all people affected personally, having a kid, having it themselves, having a spouse. But even though we're 60 people now, about a half of the people in the company have a direct connection, and about a dozen of them have it themselves. So we are very mission focused and very focused on the life lived with insulin-required diabetes by the patient. I think that is a very special opportunity we have to marry our careers with our our family's best interests. In my case, my son, who is now going to turn 23. He was 7 when he was diagnosed in 2002. So I've been on a journey with him as a child, now as an adult. It's actually a very different experience of the disease. It is a long journey for people diagnosed relatively early in life, and one which we see a lot of opportunity to help.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned your co-founder, Brian Maslish.
Yes.
Who was really one of the first people to create these DIY artificial pancreas systems, hacking into a CGM, integrating that with an insulin pump, creating that sort of feedback loop. There's this really robust patient community that are using these DIY hacked devices. Tell us a little bit more about that community, and does it say something about the industry that these patients have turned to devices that they've hacked together themselves rather than products that are really available?
Well, I think it says something about society, it says something about industry, it says something about patients. This is a disease which exacts an enormous toll on the people who have it and the families around the people who have it. They're willing to go to extraordinary lengths to live better, to be safer. Brian was the first person to create a DIY artificial pancreas system. There are now, by my latest count, approaching 1,000 people around the world who have followed his blueprint and done the same thing. You can download all the recipes from the internet and basically hack into your own systems. And the truth is that those systems are better, safer, easier to use, more connected than anything that any company it has in the pipeline besides Bigfoot. And Bigfoot is still a few years away from the marketplace. So the patients have raced out ahead of the companies, and that's because the technology is there. It's no longer a challenge of the technologies. The smartphone has been a fundamental game changer. The connected environments we live in today, the cost of computation and memory, all the pieces exist. It's actually packaging them together and delivering them in a disruptive business model that is the challenge. Mm-hmm. And so at Bigfoot, while we're very focused on the patient, that's the easy part. Making their lives easier is actually the easiest problem that we're solving. A slightly harder problem is how do you actually make it scalable in a clinical environment of relatively unsophisticated healthcare resources. Most people with insulin-requiring diabetes in this country are treated by primary care providers who have very little understanding of the disease and would never be able to train on an insulin pump or CGM or to do data interpretation and tuning of complicated devices. It's just not something that's going to happen. And if you're going to reach those people, you have to have systems that are so simple and so driven by self-training. They're going to be very different qualitatively. That's a slightly harder problem than the patient to solve. The hardest problem is for payers because they don't believe any of this stuff actually drives a healthcare economic return. And I believe for the most part they're right because the best patients get the most complicated devices that can drive somebody's HbA1c down from a 7 to a 6.5 or a 6. Those are the patients at the facilities where my son was lucky enough to be treated. Columbia Presbyterian in New York City, Stanford in Silicon Valley. But the patients who most need the help are the ones being treated by the primary care providers. And so there's a big mismatch between the tools and whether or not they're able to get in the hands of the people where you can drive the most benefit. And that's what we've spent most of our time focused on, is how to package this together in a transparent business model that's going to really be able to quantify healthcare economic outcomes and, building on the last panel, short-term ones, because long-term heart attacks and strokes and amputations and kidney failure, I wish the system of private pay cared about that, because my son is at risk of those, but unfortunately it's a much shorter-term focus. But for this disease, the really big opportunity is that people spend a lot of time in the hospital for insulin dosing errors, and that happens every year and tens of billions of dollars worth of visits. Those can be absolutely prevented.
Mm. So expand on that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your business model. Yes. Tell us a little bit about the product, first of all. It's gearing up for a pivotal trial. You've done a feasibility trial. And then tell us about the product, but tell us also a little bit about your business model.
Yes, so that's it's an important point that the two have to be conceived of together. There are so many opportunities to take technology today and to make for better consumer experiences, patient experiences, to make things easier to use, more reliable. But at the end of the day, the reason none of that's been done is that the operating models of the medical device companies in the diabetes space, they have such costs for the traditional sales model of selling to the doctor, actually providing on-site support for training of devices, for configuration of devices, big customer service centers that take calls for all sorts of complicated features that need to be explained and can be misused on these devices. A real lack of engagement with the payers, such that payers create hurdles for these devices being prescribed. Doctors have to do extra work. Companies have to facilitate that. All that's very expensive. So we have reconceived this as a service rather than selling devices. And it is to deliver a customer experience for the problem that the people have with this disease. They're trying to take this drug, which is very dangerous, in a smarter way that's easier, requires less time with a skilled healthcare professional like an endocrinologist, and actually keeps them out of the hospital. That requires you got to take all the pieces and put them together in a holistic approach that doesn't have a CGM on this side and a pump over here and an infusion set from another company and a blood glucose meter from another company and then the test strips and then the Lancets, each of which requires a separate prescription at the doctor's office, which is trying to figure out which of what your insurance covers. The bewildering complexity of the delivery of these devices is one of the things that needs to be solved. The supply chain is very fragmented and inefficient. So we're basically taking it and collapsing it under a bundled service model where there's one price, one prescription. It is going to come every month what you need because it's a digitally connected system and we know everything you're using and we're not going to send you stuff to throw away. The dirty little secret is a lot of this stuff gets thrown away, the consumable elements. Every patient with type 1 diabetes on an insulin pump and a continuous glucose monitor, you have a closet at home where you do inventory management for medical device companies. And we look through the closet every 3 months and then you purge because it's all overprescribed so you don't run out. It's very wasteful and it's because it's so fragmented, we're bundling it together. And when you do bundle it together, you are absorbing risk. It is a term of value-based pricing in that no longer is there risk of over supply waste in the consumables because the price is the price is the price, even if one person uses more test strips and another person uses less. There is not an upfront payment that's associated with a piece of durable medical equipment that needs to be amortized over 4 years. So the payers actually like this because it's transferring risk from them, as the medical device companies have historically placed it, to us. I give you a fixed price. I make you pay only every month, and if you want to switch, you could switch next month. You're not locked into a 4-year cycle. Even though that's not the traditional value-based model that people were talking about, that is perceived as delivering a lot of value, and so we're going directly to payers now, even though we're not going to be on the marketplace for another couple years, and preloading the agreements that will, with payers who are very quantitative and looking to displace the risks that they're traditionally given by the medical device companies, they're eager. So I actually think value-based pricing, if done in a way which understands the payers and gives them exactly what they're asking for, they're actually tremendously excited about it and willing to move quickly.
Yeah. So you guys brand yourselves as a digital health company.
Yes, we're a sort of dog's breakfast of things. You know, that's the reason this is hard.
Yeah.
Because we're class 3 medical device, you know, embedded firmware, apps on a smartphone, cloud systems. This is all of it together. Bigfoot. It takes a lot of different competencies, consumer, enterprise, medical device, in order to do a system like this.
Yeah, and I think, you know, around medtech, everyone's sort of thinking, how can I connect my product? You know, how can I leverage that data? How do you guys feel about data? You know, diabetes is a really data-heavy disease, very data-heavy condition. How do you guys think about data in the device design process, and how do you think about data as deliverable to patients?
I think data is the most important asset in the ecosystem. So from the very beginning in the design of the systems that we've developed or beginning to test, is all the data is captured all the time with nobody doing anything. That's table stakes for the future. If you have to plug a cable in, if you have to transcribe a number, if you have to download a driver, no, that's gonna slash by 85% who's gonna actually do it. It needs to be like the iPhone. The upgrades need to be pushed out when the FDA approves them, and you don't need to do anything, and you have the latest version of the software, and the data constantly streams to the cloud through your phone. If it doesn't work like that, you won't have the data, and data is the most precious thing when it comes to diabetes, because it is the most data-driven disease. People with type 1 diabetes have been quantifying themselves for as long as there have been these ambulatory blood glucose meters. They're sick of it, actually. They swim in data. They want somebody to do something with the data to help them.
Yeah. So you are fairly vocal on social media. You're on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Facebook, and you recently wrote a fairly lengthy essay on a CMS decision that you were not very happy about. And I'm wondering if you can take us through that data sharing decision, why you felt it was so flawed, and what you're doing to maybe work to reverse it.
Well, yes, I will. Hopefully it wasn't too long. The thing that we were talking about was the fact that a continuous glucose monitor, which hadn't been covered by CMS, was recently approved to be covered, the Dexcom sensor. But only if you didn't connect it to a smartphone. And literally, if you did connect it to a smartphone, your reimbursement was disqualified. And the reason you might want to connect it to a smartphone, because one of the best features of a CGM is that you can share that glucose value with a loved one. If you have a kid at school, I would have loved to have had this when I had my son at school, because you're just thinking about, are they safe? Did they take too much insulin? Did they take any insulin for lunch? You want to know if their glucose range is anywhere near normal, and especially you want to know if it's somewhere that's going to represent danger. Being able to have a CGM that talks to a phone and then can literally make that available at a distance to a trusted third party is an amazing innovation, also done by hackers, by the way, before the companies did it. The people who work at Bigfoot, by the way. It is a silly thing to say that that is unavailable if you're over 65 and Medicare pays for your CGM. Now, I understand that they're worried about that being a precedent for having to pay for the phone that comes with the CGM. There are certain statutory issues they have around durable medical equipment that preclude them from doing a lot of smart things. I'm not saying it's not a hard problem to solve, but it is an example of how ludicrous the system is when it doesn't actually embrace something that costs nothing. Literally, this is a costless feature because it is something available with the CGM. It is a way the world is changing. These phones, these supercomputers we carry around with ourselves in our pockets, they are the center of our lives, and if our health management systems, especially for a disease like insulin-requiring diabetes, if they aren't connected, then they're just not modern. And so I realize there are a lot of issues this brings up for CMS. Luckily, private payers get it, because they see the value of the data, and if you're not capturing it, and they also see the value of the data as a predictor of their costs, which they're very interested in.
So I want to go back. You were saying that really, the currently available technologies, they're sort of capturing the most engaged patients. How are you guys thinking about getting to the patients that aren't, quote, the most engaged? What are you doing about that?
Well, I think that there's a big shift happening in terms of how, for a chronic disease, how these solutions will be marketed, how they will be sold, supported. It used to be you went to the specialist doctor and you basically educated them, enabled them, supported them to advocate to the patient and to shove it down the throat of the payer. That was the model, and I think that our system is changing now. As we have displaced cost to the patient, they're having an opinion now about what it is that they get for the money they're spending. And also for chronic diseases, especially one like type 1 diabetes, people have a very big opinion about the solution they get. This is something that is a very big part of their lives. So they're going to be more vocal and more motivated to pursue something that's better and that actually improves their lives. And then payers ultimately will decide whether or not it gets into the hands of patients, full stop. Payers will decide if it's a business. This concentration of payers that happens means there's going to be 25 of them that are actually going to cover 80% of the lives in the private universe of reimbursement. If they are not buyers, then it just doesn't work as a business and it will not go very far. We're designing our sales efforts to appeal to them by capitulating that they have short-term interests, 2 to 3 year payback periods, that they're very focused on things that happen today because that's how our model is set up. They're not bad, they just have different incentives than in other healthcare systems. We're going to tie our star to keeping people out of the hospital for insulin dosing errors. An extremely burdensome expense, and one which is largely preventable and will go at risk for preventing them. And so that's the pitch to payers, along with some other benefits in terms of improved cost of care. But the actual patients, you got to build a brand and get to them and motivate them, and they're going to be the ones going into the primary care provider. Primary care provider will never have heard of Bigfoot, most likely. They're today prescribing CGMs and pumps. I will confess that although my son I could get him into any endocrinologist he wanted to go to, he goes to a primary care provider. He's 23 years old because he doesn't want to have an endo lecturing to him. And so he just goes and gets prescriptions, and that's just fine because he knows what he needs to do. He literally has to tell the primary care provider how to fill out the prescription so that he can get the stuff from a medical device company. It is crazy, but it's just the way the world is, and it's not going to get any better because there aren't enough endocrinologists to see all these people with diabetes. In fact, it's getting worse. So Bigfoot will literally build a brand and a relationship with the patients, and as you said, we're already pretty successful at it because we decided to tell the story of Bigfoot, the origination story of the fathers of kids with type 1 diabetes and the people at Bigfoot who are affected by the disease, every clinical trial and the patients in the trial snapping selfies and throwing them up on the web. It scared our clinical and regulatory people to death for a while, but they got used to it because the world's changed. You can't bottleneck information now and just keep it over here, and then doctors can hear this, and patients can hear that, and payers can hear this. It's all out there. You have to be responsible. We're not marketing unapproved medical devices, but we are telling the story of development of a solution that's going to have a very big impact on a number of people's lives, and they want to be part of that journey. And so, today we have about a quarter of the social media presence of Medtronic Diabetes, and we're a company of that's 2 or 3 years away from the marketplace. That is a measure of how the world has changed. And so by the time we get to market, people will actually know who we are. Bigfoot will not have arrived after an FDA approval and then begin to build a brand. We're doing that along the way. And it's required because these are hard businesses to build.
So you are working to help create a future for your son, also for the millions of other people with diabetes. What does the future of diabetes management look like to you in an ideal world?
It looks like the rest of our lives, connected, elegantly designed for consumers with simplicity, using data to self-tune devices, to individualize, to configure, saving workflow for any support for the usage of these systems in the healthcare environment. Complete transparency of data to other commercial entities like payers. It looks like the rest of our lives. That is our aspiration, is to bring all the goodness on my iPhone to diabetes, because medical device and healthcare, for reasons that are understood, have been left behind, but now they're about to catch up in one big leap. Because our system literally can't do it the old way and sustain itself. And so we're at a tipping point where a lot of things are possible that weren't perceived as possible even a year ago or 2 years ago. I'm very hopeful about the future, and I think there's going to be, at the beginning of it is chronic disease, because that's where it's most needed and where you can have the most opportunity to improve lives, improve efficiency in the clinic, and actually deliver healthcare economic